All right, so today we are going to talk about reproductive behavior. So that sounds exciting, right? Aren't you glad you showed up today? We'll talk a little bit about sexual development. We'll talk a good bit about hormonal control of sexual behavior. That's going to be exciting. Neural control as well. We'll briefly touch on sexual orientation and parental behavior. We're not going to talk a lot about we'll briefly go through a few things. I'm assuming most of you know the basic mechanics of reproductive behavior. If you don't, I'm certain there are some great videos you can find online. You're welcome to search those. I would not do it on the university's network. Don't type in like, how does reproduction work? I mean, you could probably get some good informative videos. You may get some things you don't want, like popping up on your screen while you're at the library. Do that in the privacy of your own home. So I always worry, like, anybody ever do a Google image search? Like, if you scroll down 3 pages, I guarantee you, Ray, there's something on there that you shouldn't be looking at work. Whatever it is. You can type in, like, Wayne Gretzky, and, like, 3 scrolls down, there's something there that's like, I probably shouldn't be looking at that at work. It just happens. All right, learning objectives, nobody's going to read those, no worries. So why should we talk about reproductive behavior? Well, one, it's a behavior, right? So we've talked about like why behavior is important, so there you go. It's actually the most important category of social behaviors. And here's, we're going to start off on a big hit today, right? You ready for this, Jared? You're close to the door, that's a good place to be. Without reproductive behaviors, most species would not survive. That includes the species you belong to, so you can write that down, right? So everybody should be super excited that your parents had sex, right? Because that's how you got here. So yeah, it's going to be that day where you're going to think about your parents having sex for at least 45 minutes out of the class period. So if you want to try to get that over with at the beginning, that's what I recommend. So when you leave, you're not so depressed. You just have to go wherever it is you go to relieve stress. And if you want to go do something positive after this, so get that out of the way now. Actually, you come from a long line of people who've been really great at having sex, right? I mean, if you think about this, like what if somebody way back in your family tree was not? Guess what happened? Like nobody else made it, right? So you got that to look forward to. So that's something to rely on if you're ever having any sort of trepidations about your skill set, right? Just think about the long line of folks that you've descended from who have, hit some threshold of performance there. I don't know if that helps anybody. Probably not, right? And it's like ruined everyone's social life for the next 6 weeks. There you go. So we're going to talk just briefly about this. Again, I'm assuming you made it through a biology class when you were in high school, right? So hopefully you've learned the basics here, which is going to be sort of interesting. But we really want to get to the sort of behavioral parts of this, right? Not so much the like, well, you're already in the middle of it. How did you get to the middle of it? That's what's going to be important, right? What are the behaviors leading up to that? We do have what we call sexually dimorphic behavior. I want to introduce this word dimorphic now because this is going to be something that we talk about as we go forward. Dimorphic just means like 2 different things, right? So morph is like a shape or a behavior or something. So there are things we're going to talk about. And again, we're going to talk about sort of averages, right? So there are going to be other cases that we'll talk about as we go, but we're going to really think about averages. So there are, if you're looking at male and female brains, for example, there's actually a nucleus called the sexually dimorphic nucleus, which means it's larger in one sex than it is the other. It's actually larger in male, so it's involved in some male sexual behavior. So not a big deal. So we're going to talk about different behaviors. Some species, that behaviors are more pronounced that are different. A lot of what we're going to talk about is going to be based on studies in rats, okay, and other rodents, which is going to be really exciting. You're going to think about rat sex for a while too. Right after you think about your parents, we're just going to go right into rat sex. So that's, yeah, I know, right, Matt? You're ready for this. You're ready to roll. The reason it's in rats is it's very difficult to sort of get people to sign up for sex studies, right? It's even difficult to get most of you to like look at the screen when the word sex is on it. So yeah, I can tell you're all looking down at your papers. So it happens there. You get 1 to 2 groups. As often as I've given this lecture, and I taught human anatomy and physiology for a while too, and as often as I've given this, you get 1 of 2 things. You get the this look. Nobody wants to say anything. Or you get the, my cousin has twins and it's 2 different fathers. How'd that happen? And I always say, you have a really tight calendar. So if you thought that was funny, I don't know. Come to open mic night, I'll be there next week. I don't have to be here. So there you go. So we're going to talk about some cool sexually dimorphic stories. It's going to be exciting. You've got gametes, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about, you've got sperm and ova, not a big deal. And then you have the sex chromosomes, right? So those are the X and the Y. You guys familiar with those, right? We're going to ignore a good section of things, right? So for our purposes, we're going to assume everybody got 2 X's or an X and a Y. Now there are individuals who get multiple X's, multiple Y's, right? There are things that happen. And there are different conditions that result from that. We're not really going to think about that so much, right? And so we're going to kind of breeze past that. I mean, if you were taking a class totally on reproductive behavior, or, the reproductive system, we'd spend some time on that. There you go. Just in case you wanted to know, here's how you determine, genetic sex. Everybody has to have at least 1 X chromosome, just as a heads up. If you don't get an X chromosome, you don't live. There's not much important on this Y chromosome. Really, there are only about 2 things on there, and that's chest hair and testicles, right? That's about all you get on the Y chromosome. So you don't really need that, right? Because think about all the people you know that don't have chest hair or testicles, right? And it's probably like half the people you know fall in that category, right, Eric? I mean, that's kind of the way it goes, right? It's sort of a 50-50 split. All right, anybody excited by that? The only other thing on the Y chromosome that's kind of interesting is there's a lot of junk repeats. Literally, that's what they're called, right? They're called junk repeats. It's an interesting way to figure out who your father is because every male kind of in your direct lineage is going to have an almost identical Y chromosome, and those junk repeats are going to be identical, right? And so if you wanted to figure out like who your father was, you could do a paternity test. You're going to look at those junk repeats on the Y chromosome. Now this gets complicated if your dad had a brother and you don't know which one's your dad and which one's your uncle. You're never going to know because that Y, at least using Y chromosomes, because they're Y chromosomes assuming they have the same father. Or if their fathers were brothers, right? So you kind of keep going. Their Y chromosomes are going to be the same. From an interesting sort of historical perspective, how many of you are familiar with Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings? Are you guys familiar with that story? Using this Y chromosome is how they figured out that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings had a child together. Or if they didn't, maybe someone either that's a direct descendant of or ancestor of either of them. They found that a known descendant, male descendant of Thomas Jefferson, and a known male descendant of Sally Hemings, guess what? They both had the same Y chromosome. So at some point, those 2 guys shared a male ancestor, right? And based on all the historical records, it was Thomas Jefferson. So there you go. So that's exciting, right? That's kind of old news, like not as old news because it was like Thomas Jefferson, like 1800s, but it's also like old news, they did that like 20 years ago. All right, so there are also gonads. We're going to talk about those. I love leaving these sort of phonetic pronunciations on here. In case you did not know, gonad rhymes with monad. I thought that was an odd one, so I leave it. Add a little humor. These are testes or ovaries, right? Okay, so we're going to think about both. They both play an important role. What's really important that we want to think about here are what we call activational and organizational effects. This concept is very, very, very important, okay? So Michaela, stop pretending like you're learning for a few moments and actually learn, because this is going to be important. This concept, this these organizational and activational effects, we're going to use this framework as we move through, not just in this chapter, while we're talking about reproductive behavior, but when we start talking about aggressive behavior and emotions, okay? Organizational and activational effects of hormones, you were thinking about hormones, is really an important concept in development. All right, here's a question no one's going to answer, but I know the answer to it anyway. How many of you have been through puberty? Yeah, nobody's hands are going up, right? I'm going to assume all of you have, especially those of you with a beard. Usually don't get those until after puberty, right? So, puberty is sort of an activational effect, right? We want to think about that. Organizational effects are going to be things during development. There is a phrase we are going to use often, and that phrase is prenatal androgenization. I'm going to attempt to write that for you. Well, it doesn't look like the pen is going to work, but it's prenatal androgenization. What do we mean by prenatal? That's prior to birth, right? So this is while you're still a fetus in the uterus of your mother. Okay? And what do we mean by androgenization? Androgens are male hormones. So we want to think about primarily testosterone in this case, right? And some of its metabolites and derivatives. So testosterone. So this is exposure to testosterone while you're still in the uterus. Okay? Prenatal androgenization. This is an important developmental step. It's an important organizational effect, right, of testosterone. The presence of testosterone will drive the development of the male or the female reproductive system during development, okay? That's pretty obvious, we think about that. But it's also going to affect brain structures that are involved in reproductive behavior and aggressive behavior. So that's going to be sort of interesting. We'll think about those things as we move along. Activational effects are things that happen later. So organization is going to be building, right? So during development, you're going to build a male or a female reproductive system, right? Based on your genetics. Those genetics are going to drive sort of, what hormones are present, if they're male or female hormones. You're not really going to do much with that system for a while, right? Okay, so we've all had a reproductive system since birth. Most people don't do much with their reproductive systems until like they hit puberty, right? So then you kind of turn it on. You've got all these like parts and things kind of just lying around and not really doing much. You're like, well, that's sort of interesting. I got those, but what are you doing with them? You don't do much until you hit puberty, right? And that's when you sort of click over into sexual maturity and things are activated. Okay. Does that make sense to everybody? It's not bad, right? All right. So we're really going to be thinking about internal sex organs. We're not as interested in the external sex organs, right? And there are a couple of sex organs that you might think are external, but in fact they're internal, just as a heads up, right? So you might think, well, those are actually on the outside, but in fact they're going to be considered internal sex organs. So you've got two systems. You've got the Mullerian system or the Wolffian system. This is the female, and this is the male system. You have to have hormones present to shift away from development of the female reproductive system. So you have to have the anti-Mullerian hormone, which will help remove some of the ducts and things that are in the female reproductive system. And you also have to have androgens, testosterone present to drive the development of the male reproductive system. If you don't have those hormones, right, or if you don't have receptors for those hormones, okay, there are situations where you can have ambiguous genitalia. You can develop both systems, male and female reproductive systems, depending on your genetic makeup, right? Whether you have XX or XY. Okay. We're not really going to focus on those too much. I mean, if you are interested in those, then you can definitely, do some research on your own. Okay. That's what we're talking about with androgen insensitivity syndrome. someone will have the right amount of testosterone, but they won't have a receptor for that. And if you don't have a receptor for a hormone, that hormone is not going to do you any good, right? You have to have the hormone and the receptor for that to have action. Okay. And there's your external genitalia, no big deal there. These are just, sort of developments. You can kind of take a look at these. Not really going to be too important for our system or our thinking today. This is sort of interesting, and this is a nice little graph that'll give you like this flow chart to let you know what we're talking about during this sort of organizational or developmental process, right? So here is someone who has XY, that's going to be a male. Here are the presence of the hormones and how that has effects on the reproductive system. Here's the female, and again, no hormones at all, and then that allows the Eulerian system to develop. And you go through sort of either of these pathways is the sort of typical average way to go. All right? Questions about that? I think that's kind of straightforward, right? We're sort of shifting away when we think about the reproductive system and reproductive behaviors. We're shifting away from neurotransmitters, right? So we've always talked about neurotransmitters in the past. We talked about serotonin. We've talked about orexin, norepinephrine, histamine, right? We've talked about dopamine. We've talked about all these things. We'll go back to those. What's interesting about your nervous system is it's super fast, right? So if you think about how quickly you can fire an action potential, how quickly you can remove the neurotransmitter from the synapse, we're talking about things on the order of milliseconds, right? Okay. That doesn't work so well for other processes that need to extend for some period of time, right? How many of you remember how long puberty lasted? It felt like 15 or 20 years, right? But it lasted for an extended period of time. This was not on the order of milliseconds, right? It was on the order of years, months and years. So because of that, we're going to use hormones, right? So your endocrine system is slower, it's longer lasting, right? And it's going to be more pervasive, right? And so when you release dopamine, it pretty well stays isolated in your brain, right? Because it's at that synapse. It's going to be very quick, very short. When you release hormones, right? Those hormones can travel throughout your body, right? Even though they are primarily going to be released, you have hormones released from your hypothalamus pituitary gland, and then you can have hormones released from other places. But they'll circulate throughout your entire body, and they'll have effects in a variety of places. Okay? Thinking back to that wonderful time of puberty, how many of you remember sort of those effects? And they weren't localized to like one part of your body, right? Those effects were broad and across your entire body. There were changes in your body shape, right? There were changes in size, sort of depending on what was going on and where that was, right? So this was not a localized phenomenon, right? It was something widespread. One of those hormones that we have is called gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which causes the release of gonadotropic hormone, right? And those can be a couple different things. One thing I'd really like to go back to that. But here's the deal, right? So you have your hypothalamus releases gonadotropin-releasing hormone, whether you're a male or a female, same story. That's going to release gonadotropic hormones, which travel to your gonads, right? That's going to be an ovary or a testis, and then that causes the release of testosterone or estradiol. Okay, and you're going to have this kind of going on, time to time. When you have a major spike, right, in these hypothalamic secretions, and they're going to start releasing a lot of these gonadotropin-releasing hormones, that's when you've hit into puberty and you've had that activational sort of effect, right? So another sort of interesting peptide here that we'd like to talk about called kisspeptin. Right, this guy's actually responsible for the onset of puberty. That's sort of interesting, right? It's called, you might think, why is it called kisspeptin? And then I say, well, it's about puberty, and so you think, well, that's definitely involved in some amorous encounters. It's not. why they named it that. It was actually discovered in Hershey, Pennsylvania, at the at the Penn State there campus there in Hershey. So if you think about Hershey's Kisses, right? So that's why it's called kiss peptide. Little backstory there, so you can remember that wonderful hormone. What's really sort of interesting in this, and we'll talk about this when we get into the ingestive discussion a little bit more. It's actually under the control of another hormone called leptin. How many of you have heard of leptin? Leptin is actually a hormone that's involved in like satiety signals, right? And it's released from adipose tissue, right? So the more adipose tissue you have, the more it's going to be involved. This is what's really interesting is, particularly in females, not so much in males, but in females that have lower body fat percentages, they actually hit puberty at a later time than sort of age-matched controls that are going to have higher body fat percentages. They're going to hit puberty a little bit sooner, and it's because of this story with leptin and the control of leptin over kisspeptin. I don't know, that's kind of interesting, right? So there you go. All right, so here are the sex hormones. We've got your androgens. Again, I don't expect you to think about a lot of these except testosterone. And then your estrogens, we can kind of think about those. Also as a group, you've got a few that are going to be separate with the estradiol and progesterone and so forth. We do have those hypothalamic hormones. Keep in mind this is a multi-stage process, right? So you've got the gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is going to have the gonadotropins, which is going to have then your other hormones that are released. So it's this multi-stage process, right? Because this is a huge investment, right? We don't want to accidentally turn on this system, okay? You don't want to, at the wrong time, click over into puberty, right? And you want to make sure that you're set up for the resources for that, right? It's another sort of interesting connection there with the leptin story, right? You don't want to go into puberty when you don't have that those extra metabolic resources to go through that sort of growth and morphological changes, right? So you're constantly looking for signals from your environment. All right. Who wants to talk about menstrual cycles? That's another one I never get any hands to go up. I'm just waiting on somebody to get really excited about that. In humans, we call this a menstrual cycle because that's what we do. In non-human animals, which is like everything that's not a human, and primarily we're going to be thinking about, in that case, mostly like mammals and birds. We don't really, you can talk about it in fish, we don't really think about estrous cycles in like beetles or something necessarily, but in any other species we would refer to this as the estrous cycle. Okay. But because we're humans, someone decided we needed a special name for that because, hey, whatever, they think we're special. I loved that face simile. That was like the most dismissive face I've ever seen from someone, and I enjoyed it because I think you're right. Like, well, we're not special, right? I mean, we do some things better than other species. They do better things than us, right? So, whatever, it's a trade-off. We decided we wanted iPhones in pockets. Birds wanted to fly. So there you go, right? That's what you get. So the estrous cycle or the menstrual cycle, this is really sort of changes in fertility, right? Over time, I think we're all pretty familiar with the menstrual cycle. It's this sort of 28-day repeating cycle, right? Well, once you hit puberty, until you hit menopause at least, you sort of go through this sort of period of time where, well, you got an egg ready to be fertilized. Well, that egg didn't get fertilized, so you got to toss that out with everything else that you sort of had prepared there in the uterus, just on the off chance that it did get fertilized, right? So every other month, one of your ovaries is shooting out an egg. The other month, it's the other ovary, right? They take turns, they alternate. Didn't know that, did you? That's a new one. Sometimes you get both to fire an egg at the same time, and then you might get twins, so watch out for that. You can try sleeping on the same side. No, that doesn't help. Try to give you some advice. That doesn't really work that way. Thinking about estrous cycles is important when we're thinking about reproductive behavior, right? Now, humans can be a little complicated, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to have some interesting conversations here in a few moments. I promise you guys are going to get really lively, and you're going to just really get over your inhibitions. 'Cause, I don't know, we'll talk about gorilla testicles, and I know that gets people going. So get ready for that. It's important to think about estrous cycles when we start to think about reproductive behavior, right? So what is the point of reproductive behavior? It's like to reproduce, right? That's why we call it reproductive behavior, right? And it's for whatever reason, someone has decided they want to make a half copy of themselves, right? Because you send half of your DNA and you get half of somebody else's DNA, right? The problem with that is, just as like a side note, you don't get to control which half of your DNA like goes into that half copy that you're making, right? So it might be the half of the DNA that's pretty crummy. So you should really think twice about sending that out there into the world, right? Because I know you're awesome, but a half copy of you might not be, right? So keep that in mind. And if you don't believe me, think about your parents, right? Because your kids could end up like your parents, and nobody wants that. So it's like a real, it's a real crapshoot. What you get. So, how many of you think you're more awesome than your parents? Be honest. Yeah, there you go. Thanks, Regan. We appreciate that. So the odds that your kids are going to be more awesome than you, right? I don't know. You never know. So you just don't even try it. It's the best way to do it. Get a dog. All dogs are awesome. So you're good to go. So we've got our estrous cycle. If the point of this is reproductive behavior is reproducing, then you would think that the behavior may change throughout the estrous cycle, right? Because they're going to be, the vast majority of the time, if you're a human, and I think most of you are, the vast majority of the time humans are not actually fertile, right? So anybody know, like, out of the 28-day cycle, like how many of those days you can actually get pregnant? Yeah, Olivia, it's like 4, right? So it's like 4. Most of the time, you're just wasting your time, right? I mean, it's like, just wait around for those 4 days and give it a go. Now, the opposite of this is not the best approach, right? So for those of you, because then you're thinking, well, I got 24 days to do whatever I want if you don't want kids. Please do not rely on your calendar alone to not have children. There are other things you should do. Please do those. There are all kinds of them. Okay, you got lots of options out there. Okay, use the 2 or 3 that work best for you. I want you relying on 1, 2 or 3. And as a heads up, not having sex is not going to be the one you should choose, because that's really going to last about 10 minutes. You're like, well, that was a dumb idea. Just heads up. So also as a heads up, you know what's really stupid? So I think we all know, like how many of you, and I don't have to answer this, how many of you think abstinence, that's the best way, right? That's really going to work. Yeah, we're going to teach people don't have sex, and that's really going to happen, right? I'm going to tell you every one of you is here because someone did not practice abstinence for at least ever, right? Now some of them may have intentionally not practiced abstinence, right? I'm not saying you all were like, wow, how'd that happen, kind of babies, but odds are at least a few of you are. Right, Robin? I mean, not you particularly, but you really seem to get a kick out of that. Someone in this class and they don't know it, but they were a total accident. It happens. The point is, I don't know what the point was, but, extra steps. And you can only teach people, if you get federal money, you can only teach them abstinence-based only, right? And that's to me, that's ridiculous. That's like teaching someone, you know what? Don't smoke. And how I'm going to tell you not to smoke is by not breathing. And so if you don't breathe, you can't smoke, right? So that's the best way to stop teens from smoking, is teach them not to breathe. Well, we have spent millennia evolving to breathe. We have spent millennia evolving to have sex. So it just doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense, right? It seems like a ridiculous approach. There are much better things you can do. So there you go. There's my stump speech for the week. All right. Hey, who wants to hear an interesting story about chimpanzees and their estrous cycles? So here's something. Here's a real personal question. Don't answer. How many of you know if you're fertile or not right now? You may or may not have any idea, right, if it happens to be those 4 days. Some of you may know, because you may like, write in your calendar like, hey, 3 days ago was whatever day, and, so there you go. But looking from the outside, like if I were to line up, I don't know, let's say, pick a number between 0 and 10,000, number of women, how many people in this class could look at them and go, yep, that's a fertile one right there? Nobody. Nobody's going to be able to do that. Humans do not advertise the fertile period of their estrous cycle, right? There is no way to know, and it's not just because we're wearing clothes, right? If we were to all run around naked, there's no way you can tell from the outside whether or not a human female is in that fertile period. Now, that's not true if you're a chimpanzee. If you're a chimpanzee, a lot of other primates, a lot of other species, you can definitely tell if one of the females is in the fertile period of their estrous cycle. And they do this, they make it really easy. They turn their genitals bright red, right? So they'll increase blood flow and then their genitals turn bright red. That's a pretty good signal, right? And they'll sort of advertise that. And so it's like, okay, that makes some sense. You're fertile right now, so maybe we should participate in some of those reproductive behaviors the rest of the time. It's sort of a waste of time, so I'll spend my time with other members of this species who might be in their sort of fertile period, right? That's why if you think about like breeding seasons, right? I mean, I think about breeding season. We talk about breeding seasons for certain kinds of animals, right? We think about breeding seasons for humans. It kind of happens whenever, right? I mean, it's not really synced up to anything. There's some interesting ideas about why that is, right? So if you want to think about why would you not want to advertise that, like, hey, right now I'm fertile? How many of you have ever had a baby? Anybody ever seen a baby? Yeah, Eric, right? They require a lot of work, right? Like human babies really require a lot of work for a long period of time.
About 20 years.
About 20 years, right? And so even then that's not enough sometimes, right? You still need, but really there is a very extended period of time before they're able to do anything on their own, right? How many of you have ever seen a horse that's been born, that like fell out of the, right? How long is it before that horse is up and moving?
Like 3 minutes.
Like 3 minutes, and if it's not up in 3 minutes, it's dead, right? That's how it works with horses. Now, when you were born, Jared, if your parents went, you got 3 minutes, buddy, you better be up changing the oil in your car, none of us would be here, right? Okay? It's not how it works. With horses, that's how it works. With humans, it's not, right? So a horse can really, they don't need biparental care, right? They don't really need any extra support, right? The mare needs to make some milk because, the foal can't like eat grass and things for a while. It needs to kind of go on milk up until the weaning period, and then you're kind of done, and whatever, you're out in the world. Although we do have a similar story in humans, right? They need to sort of, they need to sort of, have non-regular food, right, for some periods of time, milk or formula. But they also require a lot of effort, right? And so it's a really great idea to have like somebody else there to help you, okay? Now, remember that time I told you about other species and that like the male of that species would like only come around when the female was in her fertile period, and like the rest of the time he would be out looking for other females that were in their fertile period, right? Okay, and that's because he knows, like I know she's not in her fertile period, I don't really think it's worth my time to bring home roses and candy. It's not going to get a half copy of me, so it's sort of useless, right? We'll find somebody else who's in that 4-day window. Now, in humans, because you don't advertise, right? Guess what you can do? You can keep a guy around all the time because he has no idea if it's a waste of his time or not, right? To try to be romantic, okay? So that person will stay around. They'll stay around, and guess what they'll do? They'll help out with that like screaming ball of flesh that the two of you created because they're there, right? And what they'll get out of that is like maybe she's fertile today. We'll give it a try and see. Oh well, no, I guess we'll try again tomorrow, or however that works for you. So it's kind of interesting how the social structure in the human species is really sort of related to estrous cycles, right? I don't know, I thought that was kind of fascinating. I don't know if anybody else thought that was fascinating. Nobody else? Nobody else wants to admit to it? Aaron's like, I don't want to be that weirdo who thought that was actually kind of cool. That's okay. So that's sort of one theory about why estrous cycles aren't advertised in humans. Who wants to hear another story about human social structures and how that's related to testicle size? Well, you're going to hear it anyway, so I'm going to tell you because it's kind of fascinating. So if you were to take, and we're looking across species, so we're not actually picking out like individuals here, right? So it's like a species, right? If you were to look at humans, and then there's some other apes that are going to be involved in this. We're going to think about gorillas. It's going to be exciting. And we also want to think about chimpanzees and bonobos. For this purpose, we're going to put chimpanzees and bonobos sort of together, because for this case, they sort of have similar anatomy and physiology, although they have a lot of differences that we could talk about at some point. So what might be exciting, like if you're like, hey, I'm a primate researcher, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to go around and I'm going to measure penis and testicle size in gorillas, humans, and chimpanzees. That seems like an exciting thing to do, right? I don't know how, I think about this, and I think about like what does that person like tell their mom they do, right, for their livelihood, right? Do they like call home and be like, yeah, measured 85 gorilla penises today. That was a really productive day. Like, I don't know. I think, do you think about these things? You probably don't, just me. So, if you do this, and you were to, like, as a species, right, like take averages, you would find that gorillas actually have the smallest penises and the smallest testicles of the great apes there that we're talking about. Orangutans, we'll leave them off for now. The next biggest set of testicles is on humans, which happen to have the largest, and again, this is going to be like controlled for body size, right, average body size, the largest penis to body size ratio of any primate. And then the largest testicles and sort of moderate-sized penises are on chimpanzees. Okay, so you think about this for a minute, and it's really sort of interesting. Like, why is that, and how does that affect their sort of social interactions, right? Gorillas have sex once every few months. Right, let's think about that, right? So they have very small testicles, so it takes a little while to sort of, create some sperm so that they could try to impregnate another female. They have some sort of extended gestational period, so you kind of, there you go, that makes some sense, right? Chimpanzees and bonobos, on the other hand, especially bonobos, they have sex like every 2 minutes. Like literally, they're like, one bonobo is here and there's another one over there, and they're like, I'm going to go over and have sex with that bonobo. The problem is there's like a bonobo in between, and so they stop there. Now the trade-off here is these interactions last like 30 seconds, right? So yeah, you're having sex constantly, but it's like in 30-second bouts. You can think about that if you want. So you have to have giant testicles for that, to constantly be producing sperm like every 2 minutes, right? Humans somewhere in the middle, right? And if you think about like human sort of reproductive behavior, I think most people sort of shoot for more than once every 3 months, right? But most people are not in the every 2 minute category either, right? So we have to do things like eat peanut butter sandwiches, and that takes a while, because you got to get the bread and the peanut butter out, so you got to take a break. So I think about like social structure in humans and testicle size and hiding your estrous cycle, right? You think about these like why are human relationships the way they are? Why are they set up this way? And you might think it's like all of these like high-level philosophical social constraints, but it's really because your genitals aren't bright red and your testicles are only moderately sized compared to other primates. I think that really explains a lot. Oh, and there's this one other thing. We should talk about sexual diet. I know it's like a lot on this one slide, but this is important. Gorillas. So how many of you have ever seen a male gorilla and compared that to a female gorilla? There's like a lot of body dimorphism, right? So there's like male gorillas are quite a bit bigger than female gorillas, right? Okay. And what's really interesting, if you look across the animal kingdom, in species that have large body size differences between males and females, what you see is that typically if the male is larger, considerably larger, he will not just have sort of one mate, he'll have multiple mates, right? And we're not going to talk about these birds. There are some birds out there that they have multiple males and females. It's just a weird arrangement. So we're not going to worry about that. We're going to think about mammals, okay? How many of you love pinnipeds? That's like walruses, sea lions, seals. You guys know about these, right? So if you actually look across the family of pinnipeds, what you see is there's a lot of body dimorphism there too, right? If you think about elephant seals, you have one giant male elephant, and he has, the technical term is a harem, right? So you have multiple female elephant seals, right? Okay. And if you look across different species, what you see is that if you look at the relationship between the size of the male and the size of the female, that's correlated with the size of the male's harem. So the larger that ratio is, larger the gap is between the male and the female size, then the larger or the more mates that the male is going to have in his sort of breeding group, right? So that's sort of interesting. So you start to think about that for a minute, right? And so Colin, you think about, okay, well, so if like a male gorilla is kind of big, and then he's going to have like maybe 3 or 4 female gorillas, right? Because they're somewhat smaller, okay? And then you start to think about like humans, like why are we, and for the most part, not always, right? Why are we sort of like paired up in like one-to-ones, right? And if you think on average, if you look at the ratio between the average male and the average female size, that there is some dimorphism there, right? Males are typically larger, but not as much larger as male gorillas are than female gorillas, right? And so that's why we typically only have 1 to 2 mates at a time. So that's sort of interesting, right? See, Travis, I'm unlocking the world of science. You're going to write that down. That's good. I would not use this on an individual basis, right? Like if you're like really tall and you try to date like 2 shorter people at the same time, I would not. I would clear that with those people first, right? Whatever they say, school is cool, but don't try to use this as an argument because I don't think it's going to work. I don't think you're going to go like, look, I outweigh you by 75 pounds, so that really meant I could have somebody else. I don't think that is going to win you many arguments. Okay, so that's just a little word to the wise there. That is something to write down. Questions about that? No, nobody's going to ask any questions. If you want to know more about this, just type in elephant seal sex in your old YouTube box there, Emily, and something interesting will come up. I have no idea. Don't worry about that too much. This slide here just shows you sort of the changes in like body temperature and your hormones and your uterus over that menstrual cycle. Again, not too big of a deal. We're not going to spend a lot of time thinking about these specific changes, but I do think about this process in general and how that affects sort of your social relationships. All right. So we also have some hormonal control here. We should think about a couple things of sexual behavior in males. This is again in laboratory animals. There are very few studies. There are very few studies, laboratory studies of like actually using humans for sexual sort of behaviors, right? There was this one study, and I really don't know like how you advertise for this, but there was an fMRI study on sexual behavior where they recruited pairs. You had to bring your own partner for this. They didn't provide one for you, which would have been really weird, I think. It's weird enough as it is. But basically, one of you goes in, one of your heads, like your brain, I should clarify, goes into the fMRI machine, and the other person kind of sits on the outside. And it's sort of a manual operation at that point, right? So some of you are following along. And what they'll do is while you're in there, they measure changes in your brain activity in different regions to see which regions are involved, in sort of sexual behaviors. So again, I don't know how they advertised for that. Like, who wants to crawl in a tube and have someone watch? I don't know. It seems like a really odd study, but there it is. I would not recommend typing in like fMRI sex into your search box because I think that's going to be some weird things you're going to show up. All right, so most of this is going to be in laboratory animals. Again, we're going to think mostly about rats. In males, we have a refractory period here. Typically, this is thinking about ejaculation, so there's like a time period where you can't do that again. This varies by species and individuals within the species. What's sort of interesting too is oxytocin. How many of you remember the oxytocin story? We talked about that maybe a little bit. We should talk about it some more. It's actually a neurotransmitter in the brain. It's involved in a lot of things, mostly smooth muscle contraction, milk ducts, uterus, and male ejaculatory system. So if you have something stuck in your uterus like a child and you want to get that out, one of the great ways to do that is to use oxytocin, right? And so as your uterus is contracting and trying to expel that child from your body, it will send a signal up to the brain like, oh dear me, my uterus is being stretched. You can imagine that's not a pleasant thing. And your brain, in its brilliance, decides to send oxytocin down to your uterus, which actually makes your uterus contract more forcefully, which actually makes it stretch more, which probably hurts more. Now, in most cases, this positive feedback loop does not make any sense. You're not going to find a positive feedback loop in your body anywhere else except in this one time when you're trying to expel a fetus from your uterus, okay? And it works in this case because as your uterus is contracting and stretching, the best way to get something out of it is to make it contract more and stretch more, right? That only works because that, like, you know, I mean, how big are kids? Somewhere between 25 and 35 pounds when they're born, so imagine that. No, they're usually, I don't know, like 6, 7 pounds, right? So imagine you're trying to get that out of you. That's a time-limited event, right? That is going to end when that shoots out, okay? So then you're okay. So positive feedback loops work in that case. They're not going to work anywhere else. Imagine if you were hot and you thought, well, the best way to fix that is to get even hotter. And then I can get even hotter because now I'm hotter, right? And then the next thing you know, you catch on fire. So positive feedback loops don't work unless there is some end to the issue, and in that case it's like, you know, the expulsion of your half copy. Right, Eric? That makes some sense, right? So there you go. What's also interesting about this, how many of you know about twins? That's when you accidentally get 2 kids at once. I think that's a better way to do it if you're going to have 2 kids. And the reason I say this is, if you think about this. So if you have 2 kids at once, neither one of them is going to be as big as one single kid, right? And so when you're thinking about that exit ramp, right? So like twins might weigh like 5 pounds, like a regular kid might weigh like 8 pounds. And so if you're trying to push 2 5-pounders through or 1 8-pounder, I'm going to go with the 2 5-pounders. That seems like an easier way to go, right? Nobody else thinks that's a good idea. I tell my wife that, like, if we have kids, we're not going to have kids, so I promise you that. I was like, if we do, we should have twins. She's like, why? I was like, it'll be smaller. It'll be easier on you. She didn't like that logic. Didn't go over well at all. So, oxytocin, actually, this is one reason why, maybe not as much now, but sort of an old trick to help get that second child out of your uterus was to start breastfeeding the first child. And the reason for that is when you're breastfeeding, you have a release of oxytocin. You're going to have a dip in oxytocin, right? If you've got like 2 babies in there and one comes out and your uterus is like, oh man, that feels great. I don't even know if I'm going to try to push this second one out because, you know, my uterus is back to almost normal size. So you got to have a little boost to get that out, and you can get that through breastfeeding and get that extra boost in oxytocin. Oxytocin's awesome because it makes you feel really good about whoever it is that's like right up next to you at that moment. Which is awesome if you're like breastfeeding your kids, because I guess you ought to feel positively about your children, right? I mean, if you're going to have them. And so that'll, because otherwise you're not going to take care of them, I promise, right? How many times do you think you annoyed your parents? Like in an hour? Like 10 times per hour you've annoyed your parents, and you're still doing it, right? And so for some reason there wasn't like a chemical in their brain to make them like you, they would have left you somewhere. I promise you. My parents told me that. And they're just honest, and your parents probably weren't. So you've got that. So that's great. Oxytocin is also released, as we said, here. So if you're, again, part of that like, hey, I'm not going to let you know if I'm fertile, so you'll stay around and take care of this screaming ball of flesh kind of thing. It would be really awesome if after you had sex with someone, you felt a little more positively about them and you thought you might hang around a little more, right? So that's kind of good. Who wants to hear a story about voles? Yeah, they're actually there are like multiple kinds of voles, right? There is one set of voles, and they're these like little rodent things. It's not a big deal. Like one species of vole will, they're actually promiscuous, right? So like the males will kind of visit a variety of vole holes. They live in holes, by the way, just as a heads up there. And he'll visit the vole holes and like move around and kind of like, bring flowers and candy to all the female voles. And they do this, right, like all of them do. How do we know that? Well, there's someone whose job it is to stick their hand in vole holes. And they reach in there and they grab a handful of voles and they pull them out and they do the DNA testing, right? And what they find is that, well, the male vole that's in here really isn't the father of these baby voles. So what's he doing there? Well, he's trying to spend some time with the female vole. Now, in the other species of vole that we want to think about, if you reach your hand in that vole hole and you pull out the vole family, the male vole that you get your hands on is very, very likely to be the father of the baby voles that are in that hole, right? So not only has he like visited with some flowers and candy, but he stayed around for a while, right? He's going to help with rearing those voles. What's interesting, the voles that are promiscuous, they don't have any oxytocin, okay? So no oxytocin. The voles that are monogamous have high levels of oxytocin. So this would be sort of an interesting thing if any of you are looking for a male mate at some point in your life. You could measure their oxytocin levels potentially, right? And determine whether or not they're going to be faithful, right? Because if they have really low levels of oxytocin, then maybe that's something you ought to keep a little extra eye on. The flip side of this is if their oxytocin levels are too high, their sex drive goes down. So you've got to kind of find that level, right? Like what's the appropriate amount of oxytocin for the activities you want to engage in. So there you go, right? Nobody thinks about these things, right? How many of you are in a relationship right now and you're thinking, okay, you didn't have to, but thank you. You're like, yep, right here. How many of you have impulse problems? Right here. Then you gotta wait on that question to finish. That's okay. So here's a little, maybe you're really interested in learning about this. You're thinking about doing like some kind of hormone test, right? To check up. That's just one thing you can do, right? You can just like, you care to spit in this cup for a little bit? I'm just gonna see if there's any oxytocin in there. Check that level. So there you go. You guys all right?
It's
Yeah, that happens sometimes. I don't know if you know that. Yeah, I could give you the meteorological explanation. Or
that would be great, because I don't like it.
Yeah, you just think about like clouds having gangrene. There you go. So, questions about oxytocin? Oh, you can squirt those guys that don't have oxytocin with oxytocin, and they'll become monogamous. So, the voles. But I think it would work in humans, right? So maybe if you found like, hey, well, this is a pretty good guy. Problem is his oxytocin levels are a little low. So I'm not quite certain like why he's spending so long over at the neighbor's house. He just said he was nice and just changing light bulbs, but maybe something else is going on. Maybe you should get like an oxytocin supplement to start putting in the food, right, that he eats. Keep him a little more faithful. You can titrate that, right, too, because then you're thinking like, wow, not a lot of passion lately. Maybe I'm giving him too much. I'll just cut back to the 25 milligram pill. That's practical advice. I don't know why don't this, Travis? We could make a market for this, right? I'm certain. Like, how many of you would be interested in just like sprinkling a little something on the food that your mate is eating to just ensure that they're just a little bit extra, like not over there where they shouldn't be. I think a lot of people would be interested in that, right? I really do. Really. I don't think it's going to work on females, so it only works on males, right? Yeah, Jared?
Did they ever do that with like a bowl with another female? Like not the one that it was the father with, but like another one and see if it got attached to them instead? Because I can see that backfire.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, that's why you should always put it on the food like when you're eating with that person individually, right? So I think you're right. We should put some instructions in there about how to administer the oxytocin supplement. But I think that would work.
Is that what cheese and bacon is for?
Cheese. I think that's just to put you to sleep so you're less ambulatory. And that also kind of cuts down on the extracurricular activities if you're asleep. Like actually asleep. Right? So there you go. But you could mix it with cheese and bacon. That'll go over well. Any questions about oxytocin? Yeah.
I'm sorry.
You didn't have a question?
I thought you asked question, I raised my hand.
Oh, okay. No, I said who had a question about oxytocin.
I thought you said who has those.
Yeah, no, we all do. We all do have oxytocin in various amounts at various times throughout the day or week, depending on your social calendar. All right. So here's male sexual behavior. This is sort of straightforward. There's intromission. I don't think anybody needs an explanation of what that is. Pelvic thrusting, ejaculation. You go through that refractory period. This is a fun story about the Coolidge effect, and then we're going to talk about this cool stuff called lordosis. So, how many of you know Calvin Coolidge? Yeah, he was like a president of the United States. I'm a little disappointed that the guy from France raised his hand. And I didn't see any hands go up from those of you who are from the U.S. Man, I can't see your hands. There you go, that's better. But I didn't see any other hands, right? So like the same number of people from France raised their hand as the same number of people from the U.S. in this class. And there's only one person from France, and there are like 38 of you. You're from France? Oh, there are 2 of you from France. Why didn't you raise your hand? Calvin Coolidge, is he big in France? But no, he's like the most popular of presidents in France. I don't know, right? It's just, kind of interesting. So Calvin Coolidge, since you're a Calvin Coolidge expert, do you ever think like a sexual phenomenon would be named after him?
Yeah, I think it's with the matter of partners.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can a man can ejaculate more likely if he engages in sex with different partners.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the basic idea of the Coolidge effect, and I'll tell you how they came up with the name of the Coolidge effect. Apparently, when you're president, you get to tour farms. So I know, right? That's awesome. So Calvin Coolidge and First Lady Coolidge were out at a farm somewhere, and there was like a rooster. You guys know roosters, right? And then there were a bunch of like hens, and Mrs. Coolidge looked at the farmer and said, "Wow, does that one rooster like take care of all those hens?" And the farmer was like, "Oh yeah, absolutely, that's how it works." And if any of you have chickens, that is sort of how it works, right? You get one rooster and like 10 hens or whatever. And then she was like, "Well, maybe you should tell Mr. Coolidge that." Apparently, Calvin wasn't all that great in the Lincoln bedroom. So there you go. I don't know. And then Calvin Coolidge, in his great presidential wisdom, his response was, "They're all different hens, though, right?" And the farmer said, "Absolutely." And he said, "Well, maybe you should let Mrs. Coolidge know that." Which I don't know that went over well with her. That's sort of an apocryphal story. I don't really think that's actually true, but that is the word on the street as to how it became named the Coolidge effect. The basic idea is there's this refractory period. You can bypass that by just getting another sexual partner, right? So I wouldn't recommend this in practice unless you've like made arrangements ahead of time with all the folks involved, right? So don't just like try to test this on your own this weekend without again, getting consent from everybody. That's important. As long as you're upfront about things, I think whatever works. There were a group of researchers who decided they were going to give this a test, right? And then this is another great story from your book. And so the best way to do this, like if you're going to study the Coolidge effect, you should always do it with sheep. I don't know why. We're just going to do it with sheep. So they get a ram, that's a male sheep, and they get a ewe, that's EWE, as a female sheep, right, or a female. And so what they would do is they would put the two together, and the ram would do his business, and the sheep would be like, or the ewe would be like, "Okay, that's great." And then they're going to remove the female, and they're going to bring in another female, right? And guess what? The ram goes, wow, I'm really sort of excited about this again. Let's give it a go. If you just leave the female in there with him, he's like, you know, it's kind of like one and done. He's like, well, I'm going to take a nap now. I think there's a football game on or something, right? I'm going to do that. But if you bring in another female for him, then you bypass that refractory period. So that was kind of interesting. They did this. The first time they did it with 12 different females. And they didn't stop because the ram was tired. They stopped because the researchers were tired. And if you can imagine, like, trying to bring in like 12 different sheep, right, over the course of the day, that gets kind of tiring because they're not like little rats you just pick up. I mean, these things are sizable animals, okay? So they get tired. Then they got really creative. They're like, well, how in the world does this ram know? All these sheep look the same to them, right? And they're like, I don't know. All these ewes are identical. So they're like, well, how does this guy know? So then, this is in their brilliance here. So then they decide, you know what we're going to do? We're going to bring in a female and let them do their business. We're going to take that female over to the costume shop, and we're going to put a mask and a trench coat on it. True story. And then we're going to bring it back, you know, and see if the ram recognizes it. So it's like, I don't know, it's just like role play. I don't know, it's just kind of weird. I'm just thinking about this, right? Guess what happened? The ram was like, I don't think so. You just put a trench coat and a mask on the same ewe I've already had. I would like another one, please. So it was really, isn't that interesting? I mean, it's like, so then they were like, well, how in the world did this ram even figure out that this was the same female, right? And it's all because of pheromones. And we'll talk a bit about pheromones in a minute, but this is a really great place to sort of introduce pheromones. So pheromones are these molecules that like one animal will create, kind of shoot them out into the air somehow, and another animal will pick up on those through typically like something related to the olfactory system. I'll give you some details in a minute. So basically that ram was like, I've already smelled this ewe. I know what the story is, so I'm going to go back to the football game. They always root for Los Angeles, by the way. That was a good one. Nobody understood, but it was still a good joke. It's the Rams, right? They're the Rams here. There you go. So that's kind of the story with males, but what about the story with females? Female rats will go through a process called lordosis when they are trying to initiate sexual behavior or when they're participating in sexual behavior. And lordosis is sort of a suite of behaviors, right? So it's this collection of behaviors that first involves an arching of the back. So the female rat will arch its back, and this is true in hamsters, basically just any sort of rodent that's been studied, right? Now this is not going to apply to other like non-rodent species, okay, so don't start like translating this into humans. But when the female wants to participate in sexual behavior, she'll arch her back. She will sort of hike up her hind end. That sort of makes some sense, right? So far we're thinking like, okay, well this is just making easier access for the male, right? In case you want to know, most species don't do like face-to-face sex, right? They always sort of do like in a Congo line kind of thing. So, I mean, that's important actually. The third thing they will do is they'll start to wiggle their ears. I don't know why, but a rat wiggling its ears will apparently drive male rats over the edge. That's like the real stuff. You think that's funny, right? I mean, it's like, so you got the arched back, hind end up in the air, and then you start wiggling the ears. I really feel like if humans tried this, that would really turn people off. Because I'm trying to think about like what that's going to look like, and you're just going to look like you've got a real problem. And so I don't think that, so don't go out and try that. Like this weekend, like, boy, I've been on a real drought. Maybe it's because I've not arched my back and wiggled my ears enough. I don't know. Practical advice, right? Maybe I should tell you to do that. So like decrease the likelihood you'll have kids. I don't know. Anybody want to give that a try this weekend? It only works for females. Like males, that you know, that's not going to work because, you know, male rats, they do other things. So there you go. Quick way to a great weekend. Arch your back and wiggle your ears. For those of you in a relationship, right, you could try that, like, because you already sort of have someone, right, and so maybe you've got like some sort of, I mean, if it's a stable relationship, right, like, I mean, like some relationships you do something weird and you're like, man, that's over. But if you're like regularly doing something weird, and not like sexually weird, but just like, just an odd person in general, maybe you could give it a try and just see if, I don't know, right, I think about it. Trying to wiggle my ears, I don't know. There you go. You'd have to pull your hair back if you have long hair, right? Anybody going to give that a, nobody's going to give that a try. Who knows? Don't worry about this. This is just sort of comparing rat estrus cycles. Again, that's the same as a menstrual cycle. There are slightly different changes in the hormones. It's the same story though, right? So nothing we really need to wrap our heads around too long. All right, this is kind of cool. We're going to think about rodent brains for a while. So we're just going to start thinking about a different part of the rodent. And we want to think about the brains. So remember I said that the organizational and activational effects, right? We're not just talking about building reproductive systems, we're also thinking about the neural circuits that control those behaviors in those systems, right? That's what I want to think about this. If a rodent is exposed, or is not exposed to androgen, so it's not exposed to testosterone, for example, okay, it's going to go through those you know, those typical female sexual behaviors that we talked about. Okay, not a big deal. If the rodent is exposed to androgens, there's sort of two things that happen. One, what we call a behavioral defeminization, which is going to prevent female sexual behavior. And there's a behavioral masculinization, which is going to cause the rodent to perform male sexual behavior, right? So we're not only going to prevent, because you have to prevent one set of behaviors and then sort of activate another set, right? And that's what we're going to do here if that rodent brain is exposed to testosterone. So, this is sort of interesting. If, like other mammals, you know, these activational effects, and you have these organizational effects, right? So you want to think about that. If hormones have an effect on the organizational effects, the development and the structure in rodents, I mean, is it really that much of a stretch to think that it probably affects humans as well, right? It's probably not, right? So what's really sort of interesting about this is we can think about some of these activational effects in humans, and we can think about some of the organizational effects as well. So in terms of activational effects, you want to think about men and women separately, and so we'll do the male story, which is sort of straightforward. Testosterone will affect sexual activity, right? So if you increase testosterone, you're going to increase sexual activity, and performing sexual activity, sexual behaviors will increase testosterone. So it's sort of that positive feedback loop. Now there's going to be some, obviously, some plateau you're going to reach. Not a big deal. Females, on the other hand, there's like a much more complicated story here, right? And it doesn't really seem that sexual activity changes throughout the menstrual cycle, because there are these, you know, these rather large changes in hormone levels. It doesn't really seem that there's a change in sexual activity. There might be some change in interest. The problem is these studies are really difficult to think about and really difficult to design. And so we're going to skip ahead a slide and then we'll bounce back. This is sort of percentage of initiated sex. This is heterosexual couples, males and females. This is female initiated sex here in the blue. It's in their ovulatory phase. What you see from this graph, it appears as though there's a considerable increase right, in the number of sexual encounters initiated by the female in this partnership when she's fertile. Okay? That's really interesting, right? Because then you might think, well, that makes some sense. Okay? If the point of reproductive behavior is to actually reproduce, then you might want to increase that activity during that fertile period, right? Well, there are several problems with this particular study. One of the main problems, kind of just off the bat, is this was in stable relationships. Okay? This was in a relationship that had existed for some time, right? There was some commitment between the two individuals, right? So you might, if you were a female and you were thinking like, wow, I'm sort of fertile right now. If the person that you're engaging in sex with is someone who has been in a relationship with you for some period of time, it's a stable relationship, you might feel more comfortable and more likely to like, well, we'll give it a try. I think this guy's probably going to hang around. He's been around for a while. He even stayed around that time I arched my back and wiggled my ears, so I don't think he's going anywhere. On the other hand, if you're in a less stable or not in a relationship, right, you're actually going to see a decrease in female-initiated sex during that ovulatory period, right? And you might think of that as some sort of protective measure, right? Because if you're in a relationship that's not very stable, or you're not in a relationship, you know, and you're engaging in sex with someone who you know, may not be committed to the outcome of that behavior, you might want to think twice about that when you're at that really increased likelihood of becoming pregnant and, you know, having to take care of some, you know, screaming ball of flesh. So that's kind of interesting, right? I don't know. I found it interesting. I don't know if anybody else did. So it's really kind of hard to say, you know, so much of it in humans is context-based, right? And a lot of that's because human babies, when they're born, remember, we give them more than 3 minutes, right, Jared, to get up and start running, because you have to put all of that extra investment into them, right? So you have to be a little smarter about your choices. That makes some sense. Hey, here's sort of interesting. This is looking at organizational effects of testosterone, right? So this is a hormone treatment. This is going to be immediately after birth, okay? So if you don't do any kind of treatment after birth, when the rat's fully grown, if you give them testosterone, okay, we don't really see in males any sort of sexual behavior. If you give them estrogens in females, we do see behavior. This sort of organizational effect here with no hormones, that's what, in this case, what you would see if that was a typical female, right? Because males are actually going to be down here, and they're actually going to get exposed to testosterone in utero, right? So they're going to have that testosterone. So in the second sort of set of experiments, these folks gave these rats testosterone immediately after birth, and then when the rat was fully grown, they either gave them estrogens or they gave them testosterone. Now the males in this case, who received testosterone both times, they had typical male behavior. That's what you would anticipate. That's the normal kind of situation. Whereas up here, this is the normal sort of female situation. Females that were exposed to testosterone and then later were given estrogen, they did not have female sexual behavior. And that's because of the organizational effects, right? Because they didn't have that, the exposure to hormones that they had in utero was different than what you would anticipate based on their genetic makeup, and so they were not prepared for that, for those estrogens as adults. The males in this case, because they didn't get the testosterone at that activational time point, they also didn't have male sexual behavior. Any questions about that? Hey, this is sort of interesting. Actually, a couple stories here we should think about. Testosterone levels, we already said that sort of drives sexual activity in males, right? There's actually this study where there was a scientist, he lived out on this island for a while doing a research study. It's in your book and it's published anonymously, actually, this particular study. He shaved every day, right? He did his shaving ray. What he found is that when he got closer to the time when he was going to be sort of leaving the island to come back to the mainland, his beard started growing faster. And I think that was because he was anticipating sexual encounters when he was back on the mainland. And so, as a real scientist would do, every day he would shave and then like measure his beard shavings. And then, so he would weigh those, right? And so over time would weigh these, and then what he would notice is that, the beard shavings weighed more when he was close to getting off the island and coming back to the mainland for a brief period of time. That's kind of cool, right? So you've got that to look forward to. If you ever want to grow a beard, just start anticipating sex. I don't know if that's the best approach. But a similar story is true in females, actually. This was actually in females who were in long-distance relationships, right? And here's sort of the baseline female testosterone level, pretty close to zero. There's some testosterone, but not much. There was actually a 30% increase the day before they visited their partner, right? So in females, we even see a spike in testosterone when they're anticipating sexual behavior or sexual activity. And then it stayed elevated even after visiting the partner for a little bit of time. So that's kind of an interesting story, right? All right, let's talk about pheromones a little bit. We talked about these some. Again, this is a chemical released by one animal, affects the behavior or physiology of another animal. It's usually smelled or tasted. Sounds exciting, right? Just go and start licking people. See if they're attracted to you. I don't know that that's the best approach, so please don't go out and do that. Typically, this is going to be going through something called the vomeronasal organ. How many of you know where the vomer is located? Everybody point to your vomer without picking your nose. Yeah, that was a good one, right here, right? And then you can kind of go up that way too. So the vomeronasal organ is sitting right up there. Guess what? You have a vomeronasal organ. Guess what? It's not really attached to anything. In rats, on the other hand, they have a vomeronasal organ highly connected with their brain. Okay, lots of connections there. Some pheromones are also sometimes sensed through the accessory olfactory bulb. Right. This is using pheromones. This is how that ram was able to determine, which of the ewes he had already copulated with. How many of you are familiar with those sort of like wear a t-shirt for 2 days kind of things, and like then you smell it and you rate how attractive it is with males or females? Anybody familiar with those studies? I'll tell you about them. That's fine. So they do these studies periodically where they'll have guys wear a shirt for a couple days, and then they'll put that shirt in a bag. They give these shirts to a group of women, and the women have to smell them, and they rate them like on attractiveness. Then they'll also give them pictures of the men later, and they'll have them rate the attractiveness of the pictures of the men. And typically these two ratings are actually highly correlated, right? So the pictures that were rated as most attractive, the shirts that were most attractive belonged to that particular individual. So that seems to happen. There's also sort of an interesting sort of other side of this, which is sort of related to visual. And I don't know, this is sort of an interesting mechanism. That they'll also take pictures of women throughout their menstrual cycle, and they'll show those pictures to men of like one individual woman, and they control for lighting and everything else, right? Reading. And what they'll do is they'll have the men rate like the attractiveness of each photo of the same woman. And what they find is that photos taken during the ovulatory period are rated as more attractive by males than photos taken at other time periods. So there you go. So if you're ever getting a headshot for any sort of purpose, wait till you're ovulating. And you guys don't think about these things, do you? Like I do. I'm thinking like if I was a real estate agent, right? And I think like if you're a more attractive real estate, let's be honest, right? If you're a more attractive real estate agent and you put your picture on your card, people are going to be more likely to call you, right? We're humans, and that's kind of how we do things, right? All things equal, would you rather spend your time with someone attractive or not attractive? I don't think that's a real right? I mean, I don't think I'm really throwing anything out there that's controversial. But maybe you should wait until you're on your ovulatory period to get your picture made for that, so that like you're at your most attractive time point. That's practical advice. Try to go get your driver's license renewed while you're ovulating, so you can get a good picture. Again, nobody's buying into this, but I really think it's a good idea. All right, so there's pheromones. They're also going to connect to the amygdala, which is going to be something that's going to be really important to, olfactory systems connected to the amygdala. We talked about this to let you know whether or not you should be afraid of something, or whether or not you should, think that's a pleasant experience. There are a few other examples. Typically, these are seen in animals. I'm not going to ask you specific questions about this, but these are pheromone-related phenomena, okay? And so what we want to think about is like synchronization of estrous cycles. You can do this with mice. So if you have a bunch of female mice together, after a certain period of time of those female mice hanging out and they're only females, they'll actually stop going into their estrous cycle. It's a waste of time, right? The estrous cycle or the menstrual cycle is actually a very costly experience, right? I mean, you're getting that egg prepared. There's a lot of work in the uterus there. I mean, that thing's under construction. A lot of effort's going into that. If you don't have to do it, then you probably wouldn't, right? If you were like, what? There's like absolutely no chance of getting this egg fertilized. Why should I give it a try? And so if you're a mouse, you'll just shut that system down for a while. What you can do then is go in and squirt them with male urine. That's going to be a fun job, right? So if you expose them to male urine, the pheromones in the urine will actually kickstart their estrous cycle again, and they'll all be on the same sort of estrous cycle. You can also delay the onset of puberty in female animals by not exposing them to male urine, right? In humans, you sometimes would see this at like a boarding school, like an all-female boarding school, where they may not have, may not be exposed to male urine very often. And I know some of you are thinking like, well, I'm not really exposed to male urine all that often anyway. But guess what? It wafts in the air. So there you go. I know you're all like thinking about it now, right? Like, how much male urine have you smelled in your lifetime? There's female urine up there too, so you got that to worry about. Anybody excited about that? No, nobody's excited about that. I don't know why. So here you go. Here's a rat, sliced in half. This is your vomeronasal organ in the front. Again, it's going to be connected, through your olfactory system. In humans, most pheromone work, if it's doing anything at all, is going to be in the accessory olfactory bulb. My suggestion to you, I don't know if any of you have ever purchased pheromones. My suggestion to you, instead of spending your money on pheromones, is save that money. Because I will tell you, and this is not me being like a cynical person, this is just me like telling you the story. People who have more money are more attractive, right? Because how many of you would, all things being equal, rather be with someone who had more money or had less money? Yeah, nobody's going to answer that because you're going to sound like gold diggers, every one of you. But the true story is, you really want someone who has resources, right? And this is true whether you're a mouse, a gerbil, a chicken, or a human, right? So someone with resources. So rather than lathering yourself up with something that may or may not work and spending your money on that, you should at least maybe try to make yourself look a little more successful, or in fact actually be more successful. Those are helpful hints there. So, does that work? It's pretty good advice, right? I mean, like, work hard, be successful. You're more likely to get a better mate that way. It's a pretty true story, right? Alternatively, you can just, like, for a brief period of time, act like you're going to be successful. That might also work. The trick is, at some point, somebody's going to ask you to follow up on that. You're probably going to have to put the work in anyway, or start over from scratch with somebody else. So, life advice. I saw it on Maury Povich. How many of you watch Maury Povich? Go ahead and answer it. Yeah, I know, right? That was a little surprising, Matt, but thanks for the hands. Yeah. There's the amygdala. We talked about the amygdala, not a big deal. Here are those effects that I was talking about. Again, I'm not going to expect you to memorize these. Just keep in mind that they are based on pheromones, right? And the pheromones can do that. Oh, this is kind of interesting, though, the Bruce effect. So if you take a pregnant mouse and expose her to male urine from a male that didn't impregnate her, it'll actually result in a failure of the pregnancy. This is sort of a survival mechanism. How many of you are really interested in raising kids that aren't your own? Okay. One. We got one, right? Most people would not do that, and especially if you're a mouse. You're not going to want to invest resources in a mouse pup that you didn't help create, right? And so what you will do quite often in the animal world is, one, there's infanticide, right? So this happens a lot. For example, gorillas that invade a new territory, when they take over a new territory, they'll go through and like kill all the infants, and that will send the females who were maybe lactating or taking care of an infant back into their estrous cycle so they can impregnate them and they can have their own offspring. But it also happens in mice, so they'll have pregnancy failures if they're exposed to a new invading male. So there you go. I don't know if anybody found that interesting. Doesn't work in humans. Just wanted to give you a heads up on that, right? I think a lot of this is because, if you're a mouse, you live in a territory, right? And you're probably, as a female mouse, not going to interact with many males, right? You're going to interact with the one male who's in charge of your territory. As humans, though, we interact with members of the opposite sex all the time, right? Multiple members, and so that probably wouldn't be an effective strategy for humans. Don't worry about the spinal mechanisms there. We do want to think about the brain a little bit, though. There are a couple brain regions, and this is male sexual behavior. There's the medial preoptic area, that's the MPA, and also the sexually dimorphic nucleus. Okay? Both of these play a role in male sexual behavior. Most of this, again, we know from rat studies. So you can lesion or activate those brain regions, and you would either see a decrease or an increase in sexual behavior from the males. Then there's that great fMRI study, as well, where a male or a female, they did it with females as well, would go into the scanner and then participate in some sort of sex act while they were in there and see which brain regions light up. And these brain regions light up in those individuals as well. So there you go. Does that make sense to everybody? It's not too bad. You've got a couple other brain regions here. These are not as involved, but they are still regions to think about. There you go. There's the preoptic area, the medial preoptic area, and then the sexually dimorphic nucleus as well. Don't worry too much about this. It's just kind of showing you that pathway with the medial preoptic area and some of these other brain regions. In females, we're actually dealing with different brain regions. One of those is the ventromedial nucleus of the hypothalamus. Okay, so this plays a role in female sexual behavior. This guy's located here. So slightly different neural circuits in males and females. Not surprising, they're exposed to different hormones, right? So that's going to drive brain development in different directions. We'll talk about that in a few moments. All right, we already talked about pair bonds. What's really interesting is that that only about 5% of mammal species form long-lasting monogamous heterosexual pair bonds. So that's sort of the oddity, right? I mean, 95% of mammal species don't do that. Okay. So there you go. And again, oxytocin plays a role. Also this guy vasopressin. We didn't talk so much about that, but really just focus on the oxytocin story. And there are all kinds of breeding systems, serial monogamy, polygamy, they're polyandrous and systems and so forth in other species. We can think about those, we don't really need to. If you want to think about other species, then we can put it at some point. Trying to see how far are we. Oh, we got plenty of time. Didn't mean to do that. Now you get to watch all the slides again. That's gonna be exciting, right? Are you writing this down? All right, so we should talk a little bit about sexual orientation. There's actually a fair amount of evidence that supports organizational effects of hormones, right? There's some evidence from, again, from lab animal studies with rodents, right? So those females who are exposed to testosterone in utero are actually more likely as adults to participate or attempt to participate in male sexual behaviors, so their behaviors will match the male pattern and not the female pattern. They'll try to mount female rodents. They're not as interested in the male rodents. They actually have fewer offspring for different reasons. And they also tend to be a little more aggressive. Now this is again in rats, right? Let's think about this. I'm trying to find a place to draw a rat uterus. I know, Jasmine, you're excited about me drawing a rat uterus, right? So what's really kind of interesting about this is, and some of you that are in my other class, you saw this, my great ability to draw a rat uterus. Regan, are you the only person in my aggression class? Are you really not?
No.
Is anybody in my aggression class? Oh, so you saw my rat uterus, right? So you know this, so you can take a nap now if you want. But it's a good story, right? I think it's a...
Yeah, that's interesting.
It is interesting, so you guys should hang on. So our Calvin Coolidge expert says you guys should listen to this. So here's a rat uterus. Hang in there, I'm not done. Okay. There you go. I don't know. That's close. It's close enough for this purposes. So that's a rat uterus. It has 2 horns. How many horns does a human uterus have? It doesn't really have horns, right? It just sort of is one place, okay? But a rat uterus has 2 horns. And because it has 2 horns, and this is true in a lot of quadrupeds, rodents, because it has 2 horns, you can put rat fetuses out in either side, right? So that's kind of exciting. Now you can put males or you can put females out there. So if you put a female and then you put a male, put another male if you want, doesn't really matter. Or you can have a, oh wait, I need to erase this. Just hang in there, the story's worth it. Okay, so you have, for example, you can have different combinations out in here, right? So if you put a female, and next to that you put a male, or you put a male, so that's one combination, right? You could also have a male and a female fetus, and then another female fetus out here, right? And so what we've done here is, and these kinds of arrangements happen in a rat uterus all the time, right? So what we've done is we've basically created 3 types of female rats. We've created what we call a 0M female, a 1M female, or a 2M female. And that's telling you how many male neighbors it has, right? Because these are like peas in a pod, okay? And so if you look at this female, she has exactly 0 male members male fetuses next to her, right? Okay. This one has 1 male, and then over here we have a male on either side, so we have 2 males. What do we know about males versus females? One of the differences we want to think about is testosterone, right? Now this is getting back to the idea of prenatal androgenization. And so what you see here is this female that has 0 male neighbors. She's going to get like the normal amount of testosterone, whatever minimal amount that is. Not a big deal. The female with 1 male neighbor, she's going to get a little extra testosterone, right? Because this guy is creating testosterone, and then some of it's just going to, like, you know, float over here through diffusion to get around that female, right? So she's going to be exposed to a little bit of testosterone. The female on this side, both of these guys have testosterone floating from either of them, right? So she's getting, again, not as much testosterone as a male would get, but she's getting like 2 extra doses of diffusing testosterone, right? So that's interesting. Now what we can do is we can take these, once these pups are born, we can take them out, because that way we can know if it's male, female, whether it's a 1M or a 2M or a 0M female. We can take a look at their behavior as adults. That's what's going to be interesting, right? What you see is sort of a continuum of behavior such that the 2M females, these rat fetuses here, are more likely as adults to be, they're more aggressive, okay, because they've had more testosterone. We're going to talk about that story sort of week after next, so we're going to be here for spring break, but the week after next when we talk about emotions and so forth. But they are also more likely to attempt to participate in male sexual behavior, right? So they're more likely to attempt to mount female rats and ignore sort of the male rats. So that's kind of interesting, right? So now you're thinking like, we've got a rat uterus, but none of you have ever been in a rat uterus, I assume. Is that a true? That's a true probably statement, right? So you want to think like, does this apply to like humans? And the problem with humans is a couple things. Humans are really complicated, right? How many of you have ever met a complicated human? It happens, right? Some of them are more complicated than others. I try to avoid those. It's easier that way. So, what you see in humans is, well, how many of you shared a uterus with somebody else? That's what I thought. There's really only one way that you can share a uterus with another human, and that's to be like part of a multiple birth, like a twin, right? Are any of you twins or triplets? Maybe I should ask that question. It's a little more straightforward. No, nobody is, right, Abby? Most people aren't. Most people don't have twins, okay? And a lot of people who do have twins, if you're a female, it's really like a 50-50 shot if that other twin in the uterus with you was a male or a female, right? If it's a female, right, then there's no change in the testosterone that you're receiving, okay? But if you are a female and you're sharing a uterus with a male, so you have a male twin, right, as a female, then your testosterone level is going to be, what you're exposed to is going to be a little higher because that male is making testosterone that's going to diffuse over. And that would create a situation that we would see kind of like this. With what limited evidence is available, it appears as though there is a slight increase in the likelihood of identifying as a homosexual individual if you shared a uterus as a female with a male. There's also a slight increase in aggressive behavior. This is also true. There's another, something called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Basically, this means that your adrenal gland, which sits on top of your kidney, is constantly active. Okay? And one of the big things that's created in your adrenal glands is testosterone, for example. Right? There's a small bit of testosterone created there. Now, if you are a male and you're born with CAH, you probably don't even know it. And the reason you don't know it is because your testosterone level is already kind of up there, so that little bit of extra testosterone doesn't really make a difference. Now in females, though, this can actually be an issue, right? And there are some treatments and things. Females with CAH are also more aggressive than females without CAH, and they're also more likely to identify as homosexual instead of heterosexual. So there you go. That's kind of an interesting prenatal androgenization story, I think. I don't know, I found it fascinating. There's also some genetics studies related to sexual orientation. How many of you have heard of Dean Hamer? Anybody heard of Dean Hamer? No. This guy gets in trouble a lot. He really sort of makes claims that a lot of people don't like to hear. And when you make those sort of claims, and you catch a lot of flack, right? But he's a geneticist. He's actually written a really interesting book called The God Gene, where he argued that he found the gene that makes people religious or not religious, which is actually kind of interesting. The genetics is pretty straightforward, right? So if you're going to do a genetic study, basically what you do is you go like, hey, what genes do you have? And you've got 0, 1, or 2 copies of some allele, right? And I can measure that, and that's going to come out the way it does. When you're measuring something like how religious is somebody, that becomes a really complicated story, right? Like, is it how many times you attend a religious service? Is it, whatever, right? So, Olivia, those are complicated things to measure. I actually think this is a great book. How many of you are psych majors? Yeah. What's like the number one thing that you want to do? You want to operationally define something, right? And it's really easy to operationally define things like Travis, if you're wanting to do a study to see if workout plan A increases your deadlift. That's easy to operationally define. Increase in strength, right? Well, can you deadlift more or less, right? At the end of some period. If you want to measure something that's a little more complicated, like religious behavior, that becomes a hard thing to define, right? Because there are different religions that have different practices, and people exhibit those in different ways. So he wrote a book this long, and Regan, that much of it is about how he defined being religious, and then there's like this little sliver of the genetics, right? Which is really, it's really an interesting book because you see how he operationally defines something. So it's worthwhile as a psych student if you're going to be designing studies or reading about studies that, have said something that it changes behavior or it changes belief, right? How do you measure that? How do you define that? He does a good job of that, I think, in that book. The other thing that he did is he said he also found the homosexual gene. So he found a gene that increases the likelihood that you're going to identify as a homosexual individual. He did most of this work in men. So both of those were obviously controversial in some audiences. And so Dean Hamer is one of these guys that's sort of not always getting the best positive press, right? But the science is there. So there you go. All right, so we've still got plenty of time to talk about maternal behavior. Any questions about that, by the way? No? Okay. It's a good book. You should still read it. So what about maternal behavior in rodents? There's like a cool thing they do. They build a brood nest. For those of you that don't know, that's a nest for your brood. So heads up on what a brood nest is. A brood is like, that lot of pups that came out of the uterus. So there you go. What's kind of cool about this is, there's some hormonal control, some neural control of this as well. One of the things that's actually pretty awesome about the maternal behavior is thinking about, how many of you have ever licked a rat pup? Anybody ever done that? You should give it a try sometime. I'd really like to know how it tastes. I'm not going to do it. They taste bad, is my assumption. When a rat mother will lick her pups, because she has to clean them, she sort of makes this face. Right? And so if you can imagine, like your mother's made that face before, right? I'm certain there is something you've done in your lifetime that your mother had to clean up that she made this face. Right? So you can kind of think about what that is. Get ready, Aaron. I'm getting ready to tell you that your mother doesn't love you. I hope you're stable enough in your life to handle that, okay? So, what's really interesting about maternal behavior in rats, when they perform maternal behavior, guess what they do? They actually increase the release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens from the VTA. So the VTA is going to release dopamine to the nucleus accumbens. Now, Eric, you took a class that I taught once, all about the psychology of and history of drug addiction, right? There was one thing I constantly said in there that addictive drugs do to you, and that was they increase the release of dopamine in that VTA to nucleus accumbens circuit, right? Okay, so basically, as a rat, taking care of your pups is the same as taking cocaine. So, I like to say, Aaron, your mother does, this isn't you specifically, so don't think I'm singling you out, but your mother doesn't love you. She's just addicted to taking care of you, right? And I think about that, right? How many of you how many of you have seen your mother go through withdrawal when she's not been able to take care of you as she used to, right? Regan, does that happen? I mean, she gets a little bit of the shakes and the sweats, right? And she's like constantly trying to seek out ways to take care of you, right? I think it's the same. So there you go. Your parents don't love you, at least your mother. Your father, he may never have loved you anyway. He was just there for the oxytocin. So you got that going for you. So that sounds like fun, right? And somehow those two people got together and they had sex and then you ended up here. So apparently it's a system that works. I guess I'm not going to offer any changes to it. Except that part where, you know, on average you should have 1.25 mates as a male, right? Because of sexual dimorphism and the larger size of the body. So you can have sex with a quarter of a person, according to the math. No, nobody's buying into that. That doesn't sound exciting, right? I think we round down in those cases, right? If you don't get all the way up to 2, you just round down to 1. I think that's the way that works. Questions about this? No? I love giving this lecture right before spring break. Because I know what some of you might do on spring break, and it's not study for this class, but maybe you can take some practical lessons that I gave you today on your spring break and apply that, right? You should make a shirt. Like, I think this would be a great spring break shirt. I'm only here for the oxytocin. That would be a big seller to like 3 people. But those of us who would buy it would think it would be hilarious. Right? There you go. Any questions? Comments, concerns?